organization are seeking individuals not necessarily to have an entrepreneurial background, but to have that entrepreneurial flair, so that ability to think outside of the box, which marries quite nicely in with some of the problem solving and the self-management piece, because you need to work independently.
So
If we can
just
go into,
to
sorry, go on.
before we move on, why we are bringing up the competencies is because that is what employers are looking to see in people when they interview them. So they have listed out their competencies for their organization, and when they have someone come in, especially at a graduate level where you don't have too much experience, they're looking to see, do you have these competencies or these behavioral traits as a person, and will you bring this into the workplace? So it's very important to understand what the company's competencies are so you can demonstrate these competencies during your interview.
Yep.
Can we move on
Should
to
we
the
move
next?
next slide, please?
Sure.
Yeah, so just following on what Zainab said, so what you'll find is that particularly at a graduate level, employers are typically trying to understand, so what they'll have is a checklist of certain competencies or certain skills that they'd like the young graduate to have. And what they will be doing is they will be asking you certain questions that will allow them to understand what competencies you possess as a graduate hire, for instance. So just an example of that of a competency question that will probably be there to assess your leadership skills will be, describe a time when you led a team for a project. What was the result, positive or negative, in terms of project deliverables, team relationships, meeting KPIs, and things along those lines. So it's these sort of descriptive type questions that you may get, which will give you an understanding that, right, okay, this is a competency-based question. What they're really trying to assess is my leadership skills here. So what you need to be able to do, and a really good tip of being able to answer this sort of question, is firstly being prepared, and we'll give you a small tool around how to do that just shortly. But what's really important is for you to research the company's competencies, their values. What are they looking for? What are the key competencies that are required for this particular organization or this particular role? And what you are then able to do is you are then able to prepare some scenarios in your mind, some examples where you're able to use. Oh, sorry guys.
Yeah, so you can prepare some examples of those competencies. So for example, if leadership is what they're looking for, what you should be doing is thinking about 2 or 3 examples where you've demonstrated leadership. And again, this doesn't have to be in the workplace. This can be leadership in your personal life. It could be leadership in a group project. But what they're trying to see is, do you have those leadership traits in you? So for example, flexibility and adaptability is a competency for your big consulting firms, because you're moving from project to project, sometimes from city to city. And what they want to see is, have you ever been adaptable in your life? So they might ask you a question of, describe a time where you had to go through a change, and how did you adapt to that? What was the change, and what did you do to make that process easier? So if you have already thought about 2 or 3 examples about when you were adaptable, based on what you saw that was their competency, you will be more prepared on how to answer those questions. Another tip is how to identify that the company is asking you competency-based questions is when they ask you to give an example of your experience doing something. So that is them looking for you to tell them how you match this competency and how you've demonstrated it. So the best tip, or the best kind of way to approach this, is understand what the company's competencies and values are. What are the behaviors they're looking for within an employee? Think of some examples of when you have actually shown these behaviors, and think of 2 or 3 for each value or for each competency. And then be prepared to answer those questions using those examples, using this method that we're going to show you next.
And just to add, and just to add, guys, what you have to understand, guys, is that the employer isn't necessarily looking for you to give him a you know, every example needs to be an example that has a success story behind it, because, you know, just like in the world of work, sometimes things don't necessarily go right. So it's really important to understand, and what STAR will allow you to do is, it's basically helping you to show to the employer the way that you think, how you process information, and how you're able to communicate that information. So even in some of the examples where maybe the result may have been negative, it's really critical that that when you answer those questions, is that what you're doing is you're really just demonstrating your the way that you're thinking, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't be afraid to share, you know, negative situations, because what the kind of worst thing you can do is pretend that you've never had any negative situations, or things have, you know, always gone your way, because that shows the employer that there's something that you're not sharing. So be open, talk about negative situations, but then also talk about what you learned from them and how you're going to change what you did next time, because that shows that you have that self-reflection and that self-awareness that they're looking for. So in terms of the strategy or the tool that you should use to answer these questions, this is the best method, and this is actually the method that most employers will be grading you on. So it's called the STAR method, and it's breaking down your answers into 4 different sections. So when you're asked a question, you know, describe a time where you led a team, and what was the outcome and what were the key KPIs, like the question before. The way you should break down the answer to that question is by talking about the situation first, then the task, the action, and the result. So for example, the situation was, I was leading a group project for my university. That's the situation. I was given the task to lead the team to build a certain model, or a certain you know, presentation over a different concept. So that was the task. So the situation is that you're leading a group. The task is that you were leading, or you're building this particular thing. The action. So that is what action you took in that role. So to make sure that my group stayed on track, you know, I set up daily meetings. We met as a team at least twice a week. We handed out responsibility to each individual based on their skills and their strengths. I sat down and caught up with every team member to make sure that they were on track. So this is the action that you took to help demonstrate that leadership capability. And then finally, the result. So what they're looking for is for you to tell them what happened with you taking all of that action. So the result was that we handed in the project on time. Everyone was really happy with what they did, and that we got a great grade at the end. So, you know, it could be as simple as when you led a team project or a group project at university, but it's the way that you reflect over how you went through that whole situation and what you got out of that. So remember to break down every answer in what the situation was, what the task was, what action you took, and what result you got at the end of that. And that's typically how an interviewer will be grading you, to see if you've answered those questions in a full, concise, and complete manner, for them to see what experience and skills you have.
Yeah, so I think it's really important. So if you're ever given sort of a scenario-based question, or give me an example of a certain situation, what's really important, guys, is to have a look at some of those key competencies that we spoke about earlier on, and make sure that you've got maybe 2 or 3 different examples against the STAR method of each of, for example, of each of those competencies. A few situations where you're able to sit there and say, right, okay, for communication, I've got 2 or 3 examples in my mind that I think will be really useful to talk about at an interview. Should an interviewer ask me about, you know, have I been in a meeting, you know, if an employer asks me about a situation where I've had to use communication skills, or I've come across maybe somebody that may have been a little bit difficult. So by having, you know, 2 or 3 really structured answers that you can memorize because it's from your experience. What that actually allows you to do when you're in an interview with a particular employer and you're asked a scenario-based question or give me an example of, rather than kind of fishing in your mind for certain answers, what you're then able to do is have, you know, some structured answers that you're able to talk about really quickly, really succinctly, really fluidly, and that are well structured. What that does, it actually, because a lot of your questions will be scenario-based questions or give me an example of type question. What that actually though does is that it frees up your mind in the interview to think about other things that you may be able to offer the employer, or think about a question that you might not necessarily be prepared for. But by having those questions already prepared in your mind and in a structured way, you're able to answer those really, really effectively. And from what Zainab said about the about the teamwork piece, it, you know, not each scenario has to have a positive result at the end. So, you know, Zainab's scenario could have been, you know, I wanted to start a group. I was working on a group project. Unfortunately, you know, I may have turned up late to a lecture, so I got to work with two people that weren't necessarily, you know, that I've never really worked with before. We had some communication issues. Some people didn't turn up. The task was to deliver this project. I knew maybe a couple of the people that I was working with weren't necessarily attending every time. So I mitigated against that through putting these actions. So I became the project lead. I set up, you know, a WhatsApp group for us all to communicate. And then you can talk about, and you can say, and we ended up delivering the project. We got, you know, a C, for instance, on the project. So it wasn't the best of results. However, given the circumstances, I felt that I mitigated against that by putting these relevant actions in place. So it might not be necessarily the best result in the end, but what you're essentially doing by going through the STAR method is it's like showing your workings out when you've got a maths question in front of you. A lot of the times the ratio of the result is on the actual answer, but they also weigh you on the result, on your workings out. So by demonstrating that is a really, really powerful tool to show how you actually think and how you logically process information.
Yeah. And then finally, once you get through your interview, don't forget to do the post-interview extra bits and pieces that really make an impression on the hiring manager. So you've done a great job at your interview. You know, you messaged them before, so you've shown that you're organized, you're committed, you're engaged. You came into the interview, you answered all the questions very clearly. And now when you're done with the interview, send your interviewer a thank you email. If they've interviewed more than one person for the role, which most likely they will, say they've interviewed 5 people for the role, and you're the only one that sent the thank you email, they will remember you. It will count once that happens. So definitely do that extra bit post into thank you email. And that's another touch point that you will have with the employer and with the hiring manager. The more times you have touch points with the organization, the more you will be memorable in their head and you will stand out from the group. So any real opportunity you have to reach out and connect with them, you should do it. Another thing is don't wait on just one company. So as a graduate, you should be applying to at least 2 or 3 different companies for the areas that you're looking for. And don't worry if you've had a bad interview, because the way I see it and the way I try and teach all graduates that work with us is that every interview is an experience where you are going to learn, and it will make you better for the next. So even if that interview went badly, you don't worry, because you've become so much better from that experience for the next one. So, don't apply to just one company and do interviews for just one organization. Spread your bets. Apply to at least 2 or 3. And the first 2-3 interviews, you might not be that confident, but when you come to the 4th or the 5th, and this is the organization you really want to work for, you would have had so much more experience doing interviews that you will go in there with a whole different level of confidence. And that will be highly beneficial for you.
Practice makes perfect, guys. So
Yeah.
the more you practice, let's put it this way, you will end up screwing something up in front of an employer by saying the wrong thing or by not answering something in the right way. It's just nature. you learn from it and you move on to the next one. There's no use in sort of beating yourself up and bringing yourself down about it. Positivity is the key to actually getting a job, because people, not only do you buy from someone because of their what they're able to give you, or what they're able to offer your organization, but the reason you bring somebody on board also is because of their energy. So if you've got someone who's timid or thinks that they're not deserving of the job and they should be lucky to get the job, that's not really what you want to see. What you want to see is someone who's there, who's pretty kick-ass, that thinks that right